Hello everyone, today I'm going to be doing something of a short webinar on coping strategies or coping skills. Now, in the education sector, when we talk about coping strategies or coping skills, we're referring to ways in which we can help students to deal with the stresses and anxieties, feelings of frustration, and those extreme emotions that usually come from the learning process. Sometimes it also comes from the social side of things, whether it's bullying and so on and so forth. But generally, as teachers or teacher aides or trainers, we're referring to coping strategies in terms of how we can help students in that learning, the teaching and learning processes and activities. And I've written a bunch up here that I'll just go through briefly to give you an idea of the different ways that we can help students who are under a lot of stress or are feeling anxious for various different reasons. Now, there is one main reason for why students are, not a main reason, but a very common reason, I guess it's a main reason, for why students experience levels of stress and anxiety to the point where it affects their behaviour in some way, and that is fear of failure, particularly in front of their peers. Now, what that means is that students are not overly sensitive, but very, very sensitive, even adults, to being humiliated in front of their peers, and particularly if they're teenagers or in that upper primary school type age. Students will do almost anything to get out of class or to get out of an activity if they think that there is a chance that they're going to be embarrassed or fail in front of their peers. So a lot of the extreme behaviours that we see in class, whether it's students swearing at a teacher or whatnot, is usually caused by some type of fear of failure in front of peers. Now, that causes a lot of other issues like attendance problems, behavioural issues that are minor but usually trend upwards. I've done a lot of videos on those different types of behaviours. So please watch some of my behaviour videos as well, because I think I consider coping strategies to be something of on the teaching skills and strategy side of it, but it also falls into that behaviour management category as well. So we'll just go through some of the basics here. I'm actually going to just go a bit all over the place because they're not in any logical order. Now, if you Google coping strategies, which I just did about 5 minutes ago, it talks a lot about coping strategies being necessary because of issues or stresses or situations and so on and so forth. So just to be specific, we are in this video anyway talking about it in terms of education. So I'm just going to be a bit more specific, not so much in terms of age group, but obviously it will change, and the way in which you go about implementing coping strategies and providing students with coping strategies will change with ages and abilities and so on and so forth. Now, one of the most obvious ones that applies across the board is physical health. Obviously, a lot of play-based learning, a lot of movement integration, or MI, which is getting students to stand up and move around as often as possible, is important. As far as being a teacher aide, teacher, or other educational professional, there's not a huge amount that we can do in terms of physical health. If usually that's sort of outside our realm of influence in many regards, but certainly making sure students get enough sun but not too much sun, making sure that where possible students are getting a decent amount of food, which is why schools commonly have breakfast programs and things like that, looking out for signs of neglect and so forth. So there's a lot to that little area there, but I think we'll move on to the next bit. Now, there are various different ways in which working with students, there are various different ways in which we can help students not only prevent feelings of stress and anxiety and things like that, but various different strategies that we can provide to students. So one of those is being able to distract students. Similar to the physical health side of things, we can provide distractions. So that can be a game, it can be something less stressful. If you've got students sitting some type of exam and they're very stressed out about it, there's nothing wrong necessarily with having a 15-minute period in the middle of the lesson where they can just de-stress and do some type of leisure activity that, again, takes their mind off things, gets the blood flowing, that type of thing. So if you do notice that students are overly stressed, distraction is a very simple strategy that we can put in place to help students. Reflection is another one. That's something that happens usually after an event that is highly stressful. So again, I usually use the example of students going through exams to talk about coping strategies. So if students finish one exam, they were really, really stressed out, having a bit of a chat about it afterwards. Was it really that bad? Is it everything you thought it would be? Were all your worst fears realised when you got in there, or was it sort of okay? So just having a reflection, and that can be a journal or whatever, or just having a general chat about it after the event, or on a regular basis. So you've got those regular, almost little catch-ups. Can be quite an effective way of helping students to deal with those feelings of stresses and anxiety. As teachers or teacher aides or curriculum developers, we can provide a lot of choice to students, because quite often this comes from or is embedded in feelings of a lack of control. So if we can provide choice to students so they can choose between 2 or 3 different activities, for example, that can be a way of reducing stress and anxiety in students. We can teach students how and when to seek support. Sometimes students just don't know how to go about doing that, particularly if they're not verbal or less verbal, the non-disabled students. Something that's called prefactual thinking, which is all about, I guess, the hypothetical or what-if type scenarios, and sort of trying to avoid that negative script and the negative thoughts that run through people's heads or minds when they're very stressed out, and coming up with solutions. So that involves writing out all the possible things that could go wrong. Let's say a student is really stressed about a public speaking thing, or say a play or something like that they're putting on, and running through the possible things that could happen and the solutions to those different negative thoughts can be a way of, again, helping students to deal with stress. So that's a type of coping strategy. We can ensure that students' expectations are realistic. One of the things that causes a lot of stress is where, and this relates to this one down here, is where we predict that something will take, say, a week to complete. Let's say students are working on a project, and in 1 week they want to get that whole project done. And then when they start doing it, they realise that project's actually going to take 6 weeks to do. That can be very, very stressful, really demotivating. And that happens with adults as well. So if you've ever planned to do something and instead of it taking 2 weeks, it ends up taking 9 weeks, that process of being able to adjust your time expectations is something of a coping skill or coping strategy that you can teach students, because again, if we plan something out and then it takes longer, making that adjustment isn't really easy, and we automatically make assumptions that we're failures or whatever. So being able to recognise that as a precursor to stress, precursor to anxiety, is an important, I guess, mental process that you can go through and talk to students about. But in this type of expectation, we're more so helping students set goals that are realistic, because sometimes students will set goals that aren't realistic. And we want to set goals that are smart, they're measurable. We want to set what is known as SMART goals. So they're specific, they're measurable, they're achievable, they're realistic, and they are time-based. So I've done some videos on setting goals. You can watch those. helping students to set those goals when they're doing projects or sitting exams or whatever is a really important process and a really important chat to have with students. For example, if you do have students that are coming up to exams and they're really worried about those exams, well, what specifically are they aiming to do? Because if they're aiming to get 100%, then they're always going to be stressed out and their anxiety is going to be through the roof. That's going to affect their ability to learn. So sitting down and setting a specific goal of, say, 70% or something like that can be a really effective process to go through. That doesn't mean they can't then go beyond that, but if they do set a goal of 70% and they get 68 or they get 72 or 90 or whatever, it's a lot more fun and a lot more enjoyable and memorable process than not having a goal at all and just only thinking about and concentrating on the 25% that we got wrong in that exam or that the student got wrong. So another thing we can do is help students with that preparation and planning phase. So what that basically means, if there is something that's going to stress us out or stress students out, then they can plan out what they can look at all the different options, but they can plan out how they're going to react in that particular situation. So by having a process that they can follow makes life a little bit easier. It makes things a lot less stressful. So again, if they're going into an exam situation, then they've got a plan for how they're going to go about achieving what they're set out to achieve or whatever their goals were. They know that as soon as they get in there, they're going to put their name on the top and write their details. They're going to write some information on the back. They're going to plan out the essay side of it or whatever they're going to do. So having a plan there, and particularly a plan that has some processes in it or even some type of system that divides the task into little nice neat chunks. That's what I like to do anyway, or how I always like to talk about processes and chunking. So you're dividing your essay. There are 6 different sections in, say, an essay or in a exam, and you're teaching students how to attack each one, kind of like a divide and conquer process. And in that planning phase, you might say, well, first we're going to do this one, then we're going to do probably number 6, because we know that's going to be the essay one. Essay is always last in an exam. And we're going to devote, say, 40 minutes to that. Now, we know that one's going to be the most difficult, and this is how we're going to structure it out, regardless of what the actual question is, and so on and so forth. So you do as much planning around each of those individual sections as you possibly can. And you can always predict what those individual sections are. Now, this anxiety could be caused by anything. It could be caused by a camping trip coming up, or by an exam or a test, or some type of activity or topic or subject that the student is just generally not enjoying and really stressed about, like whether it's maths or science or whatever. Sometimes students are just anxious, I wouldn't say by nature, but they're going through a particularly stressful period in their life for whatever other reason that's outside of our control. And a lot of these can also help in that sense. That might be a video that is, or a webinar or blog or whatever, that's outside of what we're talking about here. Because remember, we are concentrating specifically on coping strategies in terms of what we can do as teachers or teacher aides or trainers in a classroom environment, in being able to help students reduce stress and anxiety, because obviously there's a lot of benefits to being able to help students do that. So having that sort of area there, there's sort of very similar things, that planning and preparation, and the more you can do around that, particularly with processes, the more of a chance you've got of reducing students' stress and anxiety down, so they know what to expect and they've got an approach and a system that they can follow. They don't have to think about it or worry about it. They just follow the process. So I guess another way we could think about that is being proactive. I don't know if that has a dash in the middle. Does that have a dash in the middle? Don't know. Anyway, doesn't matter. Now, another thing we can do if students are feeling very stressed is think about the big picture. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. So overall, in the whole, say, one little test isn't really that important. Even if you score 20 out of 100, does it really matter overall? There's another 10 to go this year. So being able to see the bigger, wider picture can be a way of helping students to, again, reduce stress. Positive self-talk, particularly in terms of reframing negative scripts. So a script is so students sometimes when they're stressed, they're saying negative things in their mind, and we try and rephrase it so that it's more positive. So if they catch themselves saying things that are like, oh, I'm an idiot, I'm a loser, I can't possibly do this, they have some strategies in place to be able to try and change that inner voice and start saying things like, well, I was able to achieve stuff last week, so there's no reason why I can't do this. Or let's divide it up. Let's divide this problem into little sections and see how many sections I can do. And if I need to get help, then I'll go get help. So that's called reframing. And positive self-talk, I guess, is the positive side, and what we try to get students to do instead of the negative self-talk, which is commonly associated with students who are very stressed and worried about something. Disassociation, also kind of known as depersonalization, which is a behaviour management strategy actually, but I thought I'd add that to this one because disassociation is, I think it's commonly known as a coping strategy anyway, but disassociation is about taking a step back or imagining that it was happening to someone else and then thinking about, well, how do you think that person would react, or what advice would you give to that person? Let's say it's a slightly different scenario or something along those lines. So disassociation, the easiest way to explain that is to imagine that it was happening to someone else and you were just viewing it as if you were watching TV or whatever, and to have a discussion around that and what advice would you give to that particular person and so on. So that's called disassociation. Oh, and we've been through adjusting the time to complete, and distractions we've been through. So that's something that we can provide as teachers or teacher aides. We can provide distractions to students. And I like to say, even teaching adults, I like to say that studying and learning anything new is a really good distraction from a lot of those stresses that are going on at home, life's usual stresses, for example. So distractions work from right at the lowest grades, right up to adults, and is a really common coping strategy, particularly if students are really, really upset. Generally, when we talk about coping strategies, we're not talking about students who are literally bawling their eyes out in front of you. But if students are upset, a little short-term strategy is just to give them a job. Can you take this note to this teacher, or can you help me sort out the bookshelves or whatever? And we've been through physical health and reflection. So that's about 10 or so basic coping strategies that will hopefully come in handy when you're working with students. Obviously, it's important to understand what necessitates the use of coping strategies, and that's that you're identifying students who are feeling stressed and are feeling anxious for whatever reason. And there's obviously a spectrum there from kind of just a little stressed out today to students who are having a bit of a mental breakdown. So depending on where they're sitting on that spectrum, you might choose different types of strategies and get other people involved in that process. So that's the basics of coping strategies and some way in which we can help students on a day-to-day basis within the normal general classroom environment.